Welcome back, everybody. This is the second of 3 videos on a more active government. How the government started changing during the late 50s to the early 70s. This is the second video. Just as a reminder, you can hit pause in order to fill in your blanks or answer questions or do anything that you want. And then whenever you're ready, just hit that play button again and continue on. Alright, let's get started with video 2. So in this section we're talking about how the government is changing under President Kennedy. Remember, he wanted big government, and one of the things that he was trying to accomplish with his message was that women deserved equal pay as men. He had this big plan that he called the New Frontier, and the Equal Pay Act was a big part of that. At the time, women made about 59 cents for every $1 that men did at the same job. And President Kennedy was trying to fix that and make it more equal. Today, are men and women making the same amount of money? Unfortunately, no. The last figures I saw were that women were making about 70 cents for every dollar that a man makes. Okay? Another thing that President Kennedy was trying to do was to help out the needy. He began a program called the Federal Food Stamp Program that gave assistance to low-income or no-income families so that they could buy groceries. This was meant to pay for the necessities that people needed, not for things like candy or anything else, but they worked in a stamp fashion where instead of giving somebody cash for an item, you could give them this little stamp, and that should be accepted as a certain dollar amount for certain items at the grocery store. This video is going to tell us a little bit more.
Hello, I'm Rosa Vasquez. Join me in this 5th episode of A History of Equal Rights in America. The years following the Great Depression and our victory in World War II saw America propelled into the modern era. An era characterized by a growing middle class, suburbs, white-collar workers, and the sudden appearance of a youth culture. But along with the realization of this new and more prosperous version of the American dream came the recognition that many Americans were still left out. A powerful counterculture sprang up, a counterculture led by rock and roll, American women, and the modern black civil rights movement. One of the last great legislative acts of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal was the food stamp program. It had become unacceptable for this nation to permit the poor and the unemployed to face the risk of starvation or live in a constant state of malnutrition.
Very few Americans living today can recall a time when the federal government did not reach out a helping hand to those less fortunate Americans. The poor, the unemployed, the homeless. That helping hand can be seen most clearly in the 21st century with America's food stamp program. For over 200 years, wealth had been redistributed to America's needy by rich families donating food, clothing, and money to churches and charities. But the problem in this private redistribution scheme was that it was inherently discriminatory. Foreigners and minorities were often overlooked. But in 1929, when the Great Depression struck, tens of millions of Americans were thrown out of work, were unable to buy food. Children were starving. 10 years later, President Franklin Roosevelt and his administration launched the food stamp program. For the first time, the federal government acknowledged that the poor had as equal a right to the basic necessities of life as the wealthy. Nearly 20 million people took advantage, exchanging the brightly colored orange and blue stamps for much needed food. Over the last 70 years, presidents from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush have revamped the program. Today, it is known as SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. People now use a debit card. During the Great Recession of the 21st century, more than 35 million Americans per month received food stamps, the largest number ever in the program's history.
So as you can see, this program is still alive and well, even though it has a different name today. SNAP, or CHIPS, is a related program. Okay, so as you guys know, a lot of the people who were fighting for civil rights were young people. One of the big things that Kennedy and his follower Johnson did was to protect students as they went into these desegregated colleges, high schools, and even elementary schools. The presidents were on the side of the students and tried to make sure that they were protected as they went into these new areas. Speaking of going into new areas, part of the New Frontier Plan was to explore space. We talked a little bit about the space race, but just as a reminder, this did happen under the Kennedy administration. He promised we would go to the moon and ask Congress to help fund the space race. That space race was won, if you can count it like that, when we walked on the moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first men to walk on the moon in 1969. Unfortunately, President Kennedy would not live to see that day. He was assassinated in November of 1963 when he was in Dallas giving a speech. He was killed by this man. As soon as he died, President Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ for short, was sworn in as the new president, and within hours, Lee Harvey Oswald, the murderer, was arrested. You can see here that LBJ is in this small room. This is actually on board the Air Force One, and the thought was that by getting the president up in the air, that was the safest place for him to be. Probably wouldn't be the same today. Lee Harvey Oswald was being transferred between prisons by some guards, and he was himself assassinated by a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby claimed that he killed Oswald because he was upset, but many people didn't believe it. There was a growing conspiracy about whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald was the only one who killed Kennedy. This even was investigated by the government, by a group of people called the Warren Commission, but they concluded that Oswald acted alone and that there was not a larger conspiracy involving multiple shooters. One of the big things that they used in their evidence was something called the Zapruder film, which I have typed a link out if you're interested in it. This is the evidence. It is available on YouTube that they had. It films the assassination. Some people believe that the shots came too quickly for it to be one person, and that there might be a second shooter on an area known as the Grassy Knoll. But as I said, the Warren Commission investigated this thoroughly and found no evidence of that. Okay. Following Johnson's ascension to the president, he continued with the civil rights reform. He also wanted to kind of honor JFK's memory, so he helped get the Civil Rights Act passed. He helped get the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission going to try to fight discrimination in hiring. And he also eventually outlawed literacy tests with the Voting Rights Act and fought for the 24th Amendment, which got rid of poll taxes. He started something called the War on Poverty in 1965. This would drastically increase the government's involvement in people's lives like it did during the New Deal. It wanted to cut taxes and set aside funds for training people. So it wasn't so much about giving out money as much as it was helping people get jobs. Okay. He was challenged in his first presidential election by a man named Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was a man who created a divide in the Democratic Party. As we talked about in class, some states in the South were starting to move away from the Democratic Party. So they started to support Goldwater and started to switch to the conservative side. Okay. Johnson still won, though, with about 60% of the popular vote. All right. In his second term, he was able to pull together the country, and he promised that America would be a great society. He tried to get health care acts off the ground to help improve Social Security. He created Medicare and Medicaid to give health care to the elderly and to the poor, or to the physically handicapped. He also wanted to try to get a new type of education going. He saw studies that said that little kids could benefit from education at a young age. So he created the Head Start program, which funded education programs for young kids, and he tried to get more funding to the schools. But he said that schools had to be racially integrated in order to receive money from the government. So he helped desegregate schools as well by promising them money if they desegregated. Last big thing about Johnson, he created the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He put that into the presidential cabinet and tried to make sure that people had places and spaces to live, as well as starting the Job Corps, which again helped to get adults jobs. It was kind of specifically focused for people who didn't have high school diplomas. It tried to get them their GEDs and get them trained for different careers. This still does exist today. That's going to end our second video, so I look forward to seeing you in the third. Come on back whenever you're ready. Remember, you can pause this, go back to it, and restart it whenever you like, or come back to it for your review process.